If Mark just disappeared, my life would be so much easier. I could actually focus on my career without this constant presence of mediocrity. The words came through the crack in the home office door, riding on Nora's laugh, sharp and brittle like glass about to shatter. Mark Carl stood frozen in his own hallway, grocery bags cutting into his palms, oranges rolling across the hardwood floor he'd mopped that morning. 7 words. That's all it took to detonate 15 years of marriage. One sentence. One moment. One choice that would expose secrets buried so deep, neither of them remembered they were hiding them. Please, before we continue, do not forget to like, share and subscribe. Mark's reflection stared back at him from the hallway mirror, a 38-year-old man in a faded university t-shirt and jeans with paint stains from last weekend's garage project, looking exactly like what his wife had just called him, mediocre. Through the door, Jessica's voice crackled through the laptop speakers. "Oh, come on, Nora. He's sweet though. He does everything around the house. Sweet doesn't pay for Emma's orthodontist." Nora was typing while she talked, multitasking even during his character assassination. "Sweet doesn't cover Lucas's private soccer league. Honestly, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just start over. Without the dead weight." The other women on the call laughed. Actually laughed. Mark backed away slowly, his shoes silent against the floor. His mind catalogued everything he'd done that day: woken at 5:30 to make lunches, driven Lucas to early soccer practice, taught 4 classes of rowdy 7th graders about the water cycle, picked up Emma from ballet, stopped for groceries and come home to cook dinner while Nora finished her important work call. Dead weight. His hands shook as he gathered the scattered oranges. One had rolled near the office door. He could see Nora's shadow through the crack, her silhouette sharp and unfamiliar, like looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. Mark left the orange where it lay. He walked to the garage, closed the door behind him, and sat on the concrete floor next to his mother's old Honda, the car he'd restored by hand, the car Nora called embarrassing when clients visited. He pulled out his phone and opened a note app. At the top he typed, "Disappearance plan." If she wanted him gone, he'd show her exactly what that meant. 2 hours later, the house was dark except for the blue glow of Mark's laptop screen. Nora had gone to bed without saying goodnight, standard procedure lately. Mark sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee beside him, and began to arrange the pieces of his vanishing. 3 days before Mark disappeared, he sat in his classroom during lunch period, staring at his bank account on his phone. The teacher's lounge felt too exposed for what he was planning, so he'd locked his classroom door and pulled the blinds. His checking account showed $3,847. His savings, the one Nora didn't know about, opened years ago with birthday money from his mother, held $12,200. Not much for a man approaching 40, but enough for 2 weeks of invisibility. Mark had always been careful with money. It was a survival skill learned at 8 years old when his father walked out on Christmas morning, leaving nothing but empty drawers and a mother who tried to swallow a bottle of pills that same night. Young Mark had found her unconscious in the bathroom, called 911 with trembling fingers, and promised God he'd be the man his father never was if she lived. She lived. And Mark kept his promise for 30 years. He withdrew $5,000 in cash that afternoon, telling the bank teller it was for a used car he'd found on Craigslist. She smiled and counted out 50s without question. Mark folded the bills into an envelope and hid it in his gym bag, beneath old running shoes he hadn't worn in months. That night, Nora came home at 9:15, her heels clicking against the hardwood, her phone pressed to her ear, her laugh high and performative. She barely glanced at Mark as he cleaned up from the dinner she'd missed, Lucas's favorite spaghetti carbonara that he'd eaten in disappointed silence, asking twice when Mommy would be home. "I'm exhausted," Nora said, ending her call and tossing her purse on the counter. "Did the kids eat?" 2 hours ago." "Good. I'm going to bed." She paused at the kitchen doorway, her back to him. For a moment, Mark thought she might turn around, might see him, might ask about his day or notice the tension in his shoulders or remember that today was the anniversary of his mother moving to Arizona. The mother who actually lay in a memory care facility Nora visited twice weekly without him knowing. But Nora just walked upstairs, her footsteps fading into silence. Mark finished the dishes, turned off the lights, and added another item to his disappearance plan. The night before he vanished, Mark drove to the storage unit on the east side of town, the one he'd rented 2 days earlier using cash and a fake name, something he'd learned from a true crime podcast during his lonely commutes. Inside the 5x10 unit, he'd already stashed a sleeping bag, clothes, toiletries, and a burner phone still in its packaging. Now he added a folder of documents he'd been secretly copying, Bank statements, credit card bills, mortgage papers. Evidence of something he'd only just discovered and couldn't quite believe. They were drowning. Not struggling, drowning. The mortgage statement showed $3,200 monthly payments, not the $1,800 Nora had told him years ago. Credit card balances totaled $87,000 across 6 cards he didn't know existed. There were medical bills, therapy invoices for both kids, and a recurring charge for $8,000 to Riverside Memory Care. Mark had found the papers in Nora's car 2 weeks ago while looking for Emma's lost ballet shoe. They'd been stuffed in the glove compartment like shameful secrets. His teacher salary was $52,000 a year. After taxes, he brought home roughly $3,400 monthly. He'd always assumed they were comfortable because Nora handled the finances and never complained. Now he understood why she worked 80-hour weeks, why she took every weekend seminar, why she looked so exhausted. She was the only thing standing between their family and total collapse. And he'd resented her for it. Called her cold, distant, career-obsessed. Made passive-aggressive comments about her missing Lucas's games, Emma's recitals, family dinners. He'd built an entire narrative of martyrdom, the devoted father abandoned by his ambitious wife, when the truth was so much more complicated. Mark sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by evidence of his own blindness, and felt something crack inside his chest. Maybe he was the dead weight. Maybe Nora's words weren't cruel, maybe they were just true. His phone buzzed. A text from Nora. "Can you pick up milk on the way home tomorrow? We're out." Not, "I love you." Not, "How was your day?" Just a transaction. A task. Another item on the list of things Mark was useful for. He typed back, "Sure." Then he deleted his location sharing, disabled Find My iPhone, and prepared to become a ghost. Mark woke at 4:30 on the morning of his disappearance. Nora slept beside him, her back turned, her breathing steady and deep. He studied her in the darkness, the curve of her shoulder, the dark hair spread across her pillow, the tension even sleep couldn't erase from her jaw. When had he stopped knowing her? When had she stopped being the woman he'd met at that community center 12 years ago, the pharmacy student who'd laughed at his terrible jokes and cried during their courthouse wedding because her mother refused to attend? Somewhere in the slow accumulation of years, they'd become strangers sharing an address. Mark slipped out of bed without waking her, a skill perfected over months of her exhausted collapses before he'd even started his bedtime routine with the kids. He dressed in the bathroom, packed his prepared bag from the closet, and left his wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to a note written on the back of a grocery receipt. The note said, "You wondered what if I disappeared. Now you'll know." He'd agonized over those words for hours, rewriting them a dozen times. Too dramatic? Too cruel? Not enough explanation? But ultimately, Mark wanted Nora to feel what he'd felt standing in that hallway 3 days ago. Confusion, fear, and the terrible realization that you don't really know the person you married. Mark kissed Lucas's forehead as his son slept, Spider-Man sheets tangled around his legs. He straightened Emma's stuffed animals that had fallen from her bed, tears blurring his vision as he remembered her asking yesterday, "Daddy, why does Mommy always look sad?" "She's just tired, sweetheart," he'd lied. Now, standing in the pre-dawn darkness of his daughter's room, Mark wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or the bravest choice he'd ever made. He walked to his mother's old Honda in the garage, the car Nora hated, the car that held a decade of memories. His mother Dorothy had driven this car to the Ashford estate where she'd worked as a housekeeper, driving it until the day Mark turned 19 and she'd fallen asleep at the wheel coming home from her third job, the car wrapping around a telephone pole, his mother dying instantly with $47 in her bank account. Mark had rebuilt the Honda from the wreck, piece by piece, because letting it go meant admitting she was really gone. He put the car in neutral and pushed it down the driveway by hand so the engine wouldn't wake Nora. Only when he reached the street did he start it, the familiar rumble like a heartbeat. Then Mark Carl drove away from his life, watching his house disappear in the rearview mirror as the sun began to rise. Nora woke to her alarm at 6:15, her hand automatically reaching for the warmth that should have been beside her. The bed was cold. Mark's side hadn't been slept in, or he'd already gotten up, made it military tight like he always did, another small reproach for her inability to care about hospital corners. She dragged herself to the bathroom, swallowed her morning Eliquis with a handful of water, and studied her reflection. The woman staring back looked 10 years older than 36. Dark circles, hollow cheeks, gray streaks she kept meaning to color. When had she stopped recognizing herself? Downstairs, she expected to find Mark making elaborate pancakes shaped like dinosaurs or his signature French toast. the kitchen full of warmth and the gentle reproach of his competence. Instead, the kitchen was dark and silent. No coffee brewing. No lunch boxes lined up. No Mark. Nora's chest tightened, the familiar squeeze that meant her anxiety was spiking, which meant her clotting risk was increasing, which meant she needed to breathe and calm down before her body betrayed her again. That's when she saw the note on the counter, pinned under Mark's wedding ring. Her hands shook as she read it. What? Twice. 3 times, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly said. You wondered what if I disappeared. Now you'll know. Nora's phone showed no messages from Mark. She checked his location sharing, disabled. She called his cell, straight to voicemail, the generic recording, not his voice. She ran upstairs to check his closet, clothes missing, his duffel bag gone, his laptop absent from his desk. The kids. She burst into Lucas's room, relief flooding through her when she found him sleeping peacefully. Then Emma's, her daughter, curled around her stuffed rabbit, breathing softly. He'd taken himself but left the children. What did that mean? Nora sat on Emma's floor, the note crumpled in her fist, and tried to remember the last real conversation she'd had with her husband. Not logistics about pickup times or grocery lists, but actual connection. When had they last talked about anything that mattered? She couldn't remember. The realization felt like drowning. Her phone buzzed, her boss already demanding her presence at a 7 a.m. meeting. Nora looked at her sleeping daughter, at the note in her hand, at the life that was cracking apart in slow motion, and made a choice she'd regret for the rest of her life. She got dressed for work. Mark's brother Thomas lived in a rundown apartment complex 2 states away, working construction and avoiding family like it was an Olympic sport. They hadn't spoken in 8 years, not since their blowout fight about their mother's care, when Thomas had screamed that Mark was abandoning her and Mark had countered that Thomas had abandoned the family when he chose drugs over responsibility. Both of them had been right. Both of them had been wrong. Mark stood outside Thomas's door at noon on day 1 of his disappearance, his hand raised to knock, wondering if his brother would slam the door in his face or welcome him like the prodigal son. The door opened before he could decide. Thomas looked older, harder, with prison tattoos crawling up his neck and scars mapping a violent life. But his eyes, their mother's eyes, widened in recognition and something that might have been relief. Mark? What the hell? I need a place to stay. 2 weeks. No questions. Mark's voice came out steadier than he felt. I can pay rent. Thomas studied him for a long moment, taking in the duffel bag, the desperate edge, the wedding ring that was conspicuously absent. Then he stepped aside. Get in here before the neighbors start talking. The apartment was small but clean, cleaner than Mark expected. Thomas had been sober for 3 years, he explained while making coffee in a kitchenette that had seen better days. Had a steady job, a girlfriend, a life he was carefully rebuilding brick by brick. So you gonna tell me why you're here? Thomas asked, sliding a mug across the counter. Mark told him everything. The overheard conversation, the financial discovery, the note, the plan to disappear and see what Nora truly valued. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Mark finished, Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're an idiot." "Excuse me?" "Mom did the same thing to Dad, you know. Before he left." Thomas's voice was flat, factual. She told her sister she wished he'd disappear so she could start over. "I heard it. I was 6. Dad heard it too, through the bedroom wall." Mark's coffee turned to acid in his stomach. "That's not. Dad left because he was a coward. Dad left because he thought Mom wanted him gone. And she did in that moment. But moments aren't forever, Mark. You're making the same mistake he did." Nora meant it. Maybe. Or maybe she was venting to toxic friends. You ever think about that? Thomas leaned forward. You want to know what I learned in rehab? People say horrible things when they're drowning. Doesn't make it true. Just makes them desperate. By day 2 of Mark's disappearance, Nora still hadn't filed a missing person report. She told the kids their father was away at a teacher conference. A lie that made Lucas suspicious and Emma anxious. She'd called Mark's phone 47 times, each call going to voicemail, each silence confirming what she already knew. He'd left her. The way her father had left her mother. The way everyone eventually left when you became too much work. Nora sat in her car outside Riverside Memory Care, her Tuesday grief support group starting in 20 minutes at the hotel down the street. But today she couldn't face the other mothers, couldn't perform stability when her life was imploding. Instead, she walked into the facility and asked to see Dorothy Carl. The nurse at the desk looked concerned. "Mrs. Carl, Dorothy's had a difficult day. She's been agitated, asking for someone named Mark." We thought about calling you but... Can I see her? Dorothy sat in a recliner by the window, staring at nothing, her hands twisting a tissue to shreds. She'd been beautiful once. Nora had seen the photos Mark kept, the woman with kind eyes and capable hands who'd worked herself to death so her son could have a better life. Now Dorothy was a shell, her mind eaten away by plaques and tangles, her memories scattered like puzzle pieces no one could reassemble. Dorothy. Nora knelt beside the chair. It's Nora. Mark's wife. Dorothy's eyes focused slowly. Mark? Where's my boy? He's away right now. He promised to visit. He always visits on Tuesdays. Dorothy's voice cracked. Did something happen? Is he angry with me? Nora's throat closed. Mark didn't visit because Mark didn't know his mother was here. Nora had built an elaborate fiction to protect him from this exact pain. His mother's decline, her confusion, her slow erasure. And now Mark was gone, and Dorothy was asking for him, and Nora was alone with the weight of secrets that had seemed protective 2 years ago but now felt like unforgivable lies. He's not angry, Nora whispered, taking Dorothy's hand. He loves you so much. Then where is he? Nora didn't have an answer. Her phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her step into the hallway and pick up. Mrs. Carl? This is Detective Sarah Reeves with the county police. We found your husband's vehicle abandoned at Crystal Lake. We need you to come down to the station. The Honda sat in an impound lot, Mark's phone and wallet on the front seat, the doors unlocked, the keys in the ignition. To any reasonable observer, it looked like a suicide scene. A man driven to desperation, leaving his possessions behind, walking into the lake that had claimed 3 lives in the past decade. Nora stood in the police station, staring at Mark's wallet and an evidence bag, and felt reality tilt sideways. Detective Reeves watched her carefully. When was the last time you saw your husband? 3 days ago. I woke up and he was gone. And you didn't report him missing? I thought, Nora's voice broke. I thought he just needed space. We'd been fighting. About what? About everything. About nothing. About the slow death of a marriage neither of them had the energy to save. But Nora couldn't say that to this stranger with kind eyes and a notepad, so she said, money. Work stress. The usual. Detective Reeves made a note. We're dragging the lake tomorrow morning. Given the evidence in the vehicle and the note he left, we have to consider this a possible suicide. The word hit like a physical blow. Suicide. Mark. Her Mark, who made dinosaur pancakes and coached soccer and cried during Pixar movies. Her Mark, who she'd called dead weight 3 days ago, who disappeared because she'd wished he would. Nora's knees buckled. A uniformed officer caught her arm, guided her to a chair. I need to call someone, she managed. The kids, I can't. Her phone rang before she could finish. Thomas Carl's name appeared on the screen. Mark's brother, the one she'd only met once at their wedding, the one Mark never talked about. She answered with shaking hands. Don't drag the lake, Thomas said without preamble. He's not in there. He's sitting in my living room drinking my coffee and being an idiot. Put the detective on the phone. Relief and rage collided in Nora's chest with such force she couldn't breathe. Mark was alive. Mark had staged this. Mark had let her believe. She handed the phone to Detective Reeves, walked outside into the parking lot, and vomited into a trash can. When she could stand again, she pulled out her phone and called Mark's burner number, the one Thomas had just given her. Mark answered on the 3rd ring. How could you? Nora's voice was raw. They were going to drag the lake, Mark. I thought you were dead. Silence. Then, now you know how it feels. Mark drove back from Thomas's apartment in complete silence, his brother's words echoing in his head. You wanted to punish her. Congratulations. You succeeded. Now what? Now what indeed? He'd imagined Nora panicking, realizing she loved him, begging him to come home. Instead, she'd gone to work, waited 2 days to file a report, and only showed real emotion when the police found his staged suicide scene. Was she upset because she loved him, or because his death would be inconvenient? Mark pulled into his driveway at 11 p.m. on day 7. The house was dark except for one light, their bedroom window. He sat in the car for 20 minutes trying to find the courage to walk through his own front door. When he finally entered, the house felt different. Smaller. Colder. The kitchen counter was covered in medical bills he'd never seen before, hospital invoices, prescription receipts. In the center sat a folder labeled, Mark, read this. Inside were documents that shattered every assumption he'd made. Dorothy's memory care facility invoices dating back 2 years. Nora had been paying $8,000 monthly for the mother Mark thought was living happily in Arizona. Therapy bills for Lucas, dyslexia treatment Mark didn't know his son needed. Therapy bills for Emma, selective mutism triggered by trauma Mark hadn't noticed. Hospital records from Nora's miscarriage 3 years ago, including a diagnosis he'd never heard. Factor V Leiden, life-threatening clotting disorder requiring daily medication and constant medical monitoring. Receipts from Riverside Inn, not for an affair, but for a pregnancy loss support group Nora had been attending twice weekly for 3 years. A letter from Dr. Patricia Brennan, Nora's therapist, explaining that Nora had been suffering from severe PTSD and depression since losing their daughter Sophie, that she'd been protecting Mark from the truth because he'd told her repeatedly he couldn't handle medical stuff. And finally, a financial summary showing that Nora's salary alone was keeping them from bankruptcy, that every business trip and late night was Nora desperately trying to save a family that resented her for working. Mark's hands shook as he read. The narrative he'd built, devoted father abandoned by cold, ambitious wife, crumbled into dust. Footsteps on the stairs. Nora appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas, looking hollowed out. "Did you read it?" she asked. "Nora, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. You made it very clear you didn't want to know." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Every time I tried to talk about finances, you said money isn't everything. Every time I mentioned medical issues, you shut down. Every time I needed actual support instead of pancakes and martyrdom, you checked out. That's not fair." "Fair?" Nora laughed, bitter and broken. "You disappeared for a week to teach me a lesson. The police were dragging the lake. Our children thought you were dead. And you want to talk about fair?" Mark had no answer. They sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., the folder of truths between them like a third presence. Neither had slept. Neither could look away. "I had a miscarriage," Nora said finally. 3 years ago. 22 weeks. A daughter. We named her Sophie Rose. Mark remembered, vaguely, distantly, like something that had happened to someone else. He'd been so focused on moving forward, on being positive, on not dwelling. He'd cleaned out the nursery to help Nora heal, never asking if that's what she needed. "I remember," he whispered. "Do you? Do you remember holding her?" Nora's voice cracked. "Because I do. I held her for 2 hours. She was perfect. She had your nose. And you couldn't even come in the room. I couldn't, seeing her like that, I couldn't." "I know. You can't handle medical things. You can't handle emotions. You can't handle real problems. So I handled them. Alone. For 3 years. Nora pulled out her phone, showed him photos he'd never seen. Their daughter's tiny perfect face, her impossibly small hands, her dark hair. "I went to therapy twice a week to learn how to function. I joined a support group for mothers who've lost babies. I took medication for depression while you complained I seemed distant." Mark's vision blurred. "I didn't know you were suffering. Because you didn't ask. You made breakfast and coached soccer and played devoted dad, and you never once asked me how I was actually doing. You wanted the performance of a happy wife, not the reality of a traumatized one." "And the money?" Mark gestured at the bills. "Why didn't you tell me we were drowning?" "I tried. For times I tried to discuss the Denver promotion. For times you said, if that's what you want, like my career was a selfish indulgence instead of our family's lifeline. You literally can't engage with financial stress because it triggers your childhood poverty trauma, so you stick your head in the sand and let me carry it alone." Mark saw himself clearly for the first time, not the selfless martyr of his imagination, but a man who'd weaponized his niceness, turned his sacrifices into emotional leverage, and avoided every difficult conversation by making breakfast instead. "Your mother," Nora continued. "She has Alzheimer's. Severe. She's in a facility. I've been visiting her twice weekly for 2 years, paying $8,000 a month, handling her medical crises alone. Because you told me you couldn't watch her decline. You lied to me about where she is. To protect you. Like I protected you from our daughter's death, from our financial collapse, from Lucas's learning disability, from Emma's trauma. I've been protecting you from reality for 3 years while you resented me for not being grateful enough for your goddamn pancakes." Dawn broke over the kitchen table. Neither Mark nor Nora had moved. The truth sat between them like broken glass, dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. "The things you said," Mark finally spoke. "To your work friends. About me disappearing, about dead weight. I know what I said." Nora's voice was raw from crying. "And I meant it. In that moment, I did wish you'd disappear. Do you know how exhausting it is to be resented for keeping us afloat? To work 80 hours a week and come home to passive-aggressive sighs because I missed another soccer game. I never asked you to work that much. You didn't have to ask. Someone had to save us. It wasn't going to be you, you're too busy being noble and suffering beautifully. She stood abruptly pacing. You built your entire identity on being the good guy, the devoted husband, the selfless father. And when I didn't perform enough gratitude for your sacrifices, you punished me by disappearing. Mark flinched. I wanted to see if you'd miss me. Of course I'd miss you, you idiot. But missing you doesn't erase my resentment. Both things can be true. I can love you and still wish sometimes that I could breathe without your martyrdom crushing me. The words hung in the air, brutal and honest. So what now? Mark asked quietly. Nora pulled out papers from the folder, a job offer letter from her pharmaceutical company. Regional Director. Denver. $180,000 a year. Guaranteed salary plus bonuses. The promotion that could save them. I accepted this yesterday, she said. We move to Denver in 60 days or I file for divorce. Those are your options. Mark stared at the letter. You're giving me an ultimatum? I'm giving us a chance. A real one. But it requires you to actually show up. For therapy, for hard conversations, for our actual life instead of the performance of one. If you can't do that, then maybe we both deserve better. Emma appeared in the doorway, small and pale in her princess pajamas, her rabbit clutched to her chest. Daddy? Her voice was tiny. Are you really back? Or are you going to disappear again? Mark's heart shattered. He knelt, opening his arms. Emma ran to him, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm back, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I'm back. But as he held his daughter, Mark looked at Nora over Emma's head and saw the truth in his wife's eyes. Back wasn't enough. Change was what they needed. And he didn't know if he knew how. 3 months later, the Carl family stood in front of a new house in Denver. Lucas bounced with excitement about the bigger yard. Emma held both her parents' hands, her selective mutism improving with consistent therapy. Nora's new job had started 2 weeks ago. Stable income, reasonable hours, actual work-life balance. Mark had taken a sabbatical from teaching to focus on therapy. Twice weekly sessions with Dr. Richard Kowalski, who specialized in helper syndrome and childhood trauma. The work was brutal, unpacking his savior complex, his martyr tendencies, his avoidance of real intimacy in favor of performative sacrifice. Some days Mark wanted to quit. Some days he resented Nora for forcing this change. But then he'd remember Emma asking if he'd disappear again and he'd keep going. They'd visited Dorothy before leaving, together, finally. Mark had held his mother's hand while she didn't recognize him, and Nora had held Mark while he grieved the mother he'd already lost. The facility in Denver was nicer, closer, affordable now with Nora's salary. They'd visit weekly, both of them sharing the weight. The marriage counselor said they had a 40% chance of making it. The damage ran deep, years of resentment on both sides, communication patterns that needed complete rewiring, trust that had to be rebuilt from rubble. But Mark was trying. Really trying, not just performing effort. He'd learned to sit with discomfort instead of fixing it. To ask Nora how she felt instead of assuming. To acknowledge his own pain without weaponizing it. And Nora was trying too, learning to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone, to share her fears instead of protecting Mark from reality, to believe that maybe this time he'd actually show up. Some nights they still slept on opposite sides of the bed, careful not to touch. But some nights, Mark would reach for Nora's hand in the darkness, and she'd let him hold it. It wasn't healed, but it was healing. The moving truck pulled away. Lucas ran toward the house shouting about claimed bedrooms. Emma looked up at her parents. Is this our forever house? She asked. Mark and Nora looked at each other, really looked, seeing the scars and the hope in the uncertain future. It's our right now house, Nora said carefully. And right now is enough, Mark added. Emma seemed satisfied. She ran after her brother, leaving Mark and Nora standing in the driveway of their new life. Thank you, Mark said quietly. For not giving up. Thank you for coming back, Nora replied. For real this time. They walked toward the house together, not quite touching but not quite separate either. Two people learning that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect sacrifices, but about showing up for the messy, complicated, imperfect reality of each other. Behind them, Mark's mother's old Honda sat in the driveway, freshly serviced, kept despite Nora's original objections, a reminder of where they'd been. In front of them, a house full of unpacked boxes and new beginnings waited. And between them, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, disappeared wasn't forever.